Jacob tightened his grip on Shadow's leash, his knuckles turning white. The air outside the Veterans Hospital was thick with tension. A group of officers stood in front of him, their uniforms crisp, their expressions unreadable. At the front of the pack, Officer Nolan adjusted his belt and took a step forward. "We have an order to confiscate the dog," Nolan announced, his voice devoid of sympathy. "Hand him over now, or we'll have to take action." Jacob felt Shadow tense beside him. The dog wasn't just any dog, he was a war hero, a loyal companion who had saved Jacob's life more times than he could count. The idea of letting some bureaucratic bully take him away was unthinkable. "If you want him," Jacob said, his voice low and firm, "you're going to have to step over my dead body." Nolan sighed, shaking his head as if dealing with a stubborn child. "Look, I don't want to make this difficult. City ordinance prohibits dangerous breeds, and this animal fits the description. You don't have a choice." Jacob clenched his jaw. "That's where you're wrong." A murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered. Nurses and patients from the hospital peeked through the windows, watching the confrontation unfold. Behind Jacob, Emma, the hospital's veterinarian, placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Jacob, don't do anything reckless," she whispered. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the concern in her eyes. "They're not taking him," he said. Nolan's patience was wearing thin. "I'm giving you one last chance. Step aside." Jacob didn't move. A tense silence settled between them. Then, without warning, Nolan gestured to his officers. Two of them stepped forward, hands resting on their batons. Shadow let out a low growl, his muscles coiling like a spring. "Don't," Jacob warned. But they didn't listen. The moment one of them reached for Shadow, Jacob reacted. Years of military training took over. In a swift motion, he sidestepped, pulling Shadow back while blocking the officer's arm. The man stumbled, startled by the sudden resistance. Nolan's face darkened. "That's assault on an officer." Jacob exhaled sharply, preparing for what was coming next. He knew he couldn't fight them all. But he also knew he wasn't alone. From behind him, a deep voice called out. "That's funny," the voice said. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're the one causing the problem." Jacob turned his head and felt relief flood through him. Standing at the hospital's entrance was a group of men and women in civilian clothes. Men and women who had once worn the same uniform as him. His brothers and sisters in arms. "Now," one of them said, stepping forward, "who wants to explain why the hell you're trying to take a Marine's dog?" Jacob had never imagined that his return home would lead to this moment. After years of service overseas, after firefights and ambushes, after losing brothers in arms and carrying wounds both visible and hidden, he thought he had left the battlefield behind. But as he stood in front of the Veterans Hospital, staring down a group of city officers trying to take the only companion that had ever truly understood him, he realized the fight wasn't over. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was the last remaining link to a past that most people wouldn't understand. Shadow had been with Jacob through the worst of it. In the dust and chaos of Kabul, when the deafening sound of gunfire and explosions had become the rhythm of their days, Shadow had been the one constant force keeping him grounded. A military working dog trained for detection, Shadow had not only saved lives but had also kept Jacob from losing himself in the war. When the deployment ended and the soldiers returned home, most of the K-9 units were reassigned, but Shadow had suffered a severe injury during an operation, one that made him unfit for active duty. The military had given Jacob the option to adopt him, and he hadn't hesitated. It was the only decision in his life that had ever made perfect sense. Now, Officer Nolan and his team wanted to take him away under some flimsy excuse about city regulations. Jacob knew better. He had seen men like Nolan before, small-time enforcers who let authority get to their heads. Men who needed to control something, even if it was just a man and his dog. The real reason Nolan wanted Shadow gone had nothing to do with the law and everything to do with the fact that he saw Jacob and Shadow as a problem he needed to erase. Jacob glanced to his side, where Emma stood with her arms crossed, her sharp eyes locked onto Nolan. She was the one person who had always been there, long before the war, long before everything changed. They had grown up together, fallen in love too young, and lost each other when Jacob enlisted. He had pushed her away back then, convinced that he didn't deserve the life she wanted to give him. But fate had a way of bringing people back into each other's lives, and when Jacob had walked into the hospital months ago with a wounded Shadow, she had been the one to patch him up. That day, when she had lifted her head and met his gaze after years of silence, something had shifted between them, something that neither of them had dared to name. Nolan's voice cut through his thoughts. "I don't care how many people stand behind you, Jacob. The law is the law. The city has regulations against aggressive breeds, and this pit bull qualifies." Jacob exhaled slowly. "Shadow isn't aggressive. That's not for you to decide." Nolan stepped closer, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Now, are you going to cooperate, or do I have to arrest you in front of all your friends?" Jacob didn't flinch, but inside, the weight of the moment pressed against his ribs like a vice. He knew where this was heading. He could see it in Nolan's eyes. The man wasn't going to back down, and the more resistance he met, the more determined he would become. The only way to win this fight was to find another way. He turned his head slightly, just enough to meet the gaze of one of the men standing behind him, David Cole, a former Marine with a sharp mind and an even sharper instinct for strategy. Jacob didn't have to say a word. David had already pulled out his phone, his fingers moving rapidly over the screen. A moment later, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "This property," David said, his voice carrying over the tension, "belongs to the Department of Veterans Affairs. It's federal land." Silence. Jacob saw the flicker of confusion in Nolan's eyes before it hardened into something more dangerous. David continued, stepping forward. "That means your city ordinance?" He raised an eyebrow. "It doesn't apply here." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Jacob kept his eyes on Nolan, watching the battle play out in real time. Nolan's fingers twitched at his side, his jaw clenched, his brain working to find a way around what he had just been told. But there wasn't one. The law wasn't on his side anymore. Jacob felt Shadow press against his leg, a silent reminder that this wasn't just about a legal technicality. This was about loyalty, about standing your ground even when the odds were stacked against you. He wasn't alone in this fight, and he never had been. Emma took a step forward, her voice firm. "So unless you have federal jurisdiction, Officer Nolan, I'd suggest you back off." For the first time, Nolan hesitated. The power he had wielded so confidently just moments ago had been stripped from his grasp. Jacob watched as the reality of the situation settled in, the muscles in Nolan's face twitching as he realized he had lost. And just like that, the tide had turned. Nolan's hesitation lasted only a moment before his arrogance took over again. He straightened his shoulders, his smirk returning as he looked Jacob up and down. "So you think you've won?" He sneered. "This isn't over." Jacob didn't move, didn't blink. He had dealt with worse threats before. The battlefield had taught him that the most dangerous men weren't the ones who shouted, but the ones who stayed calm when the stakes were highest. And right now, Nolan was rattled, grasping at whatever control he thought he still had. "You're trespassing," Nolan continued. "Sure, this is federal land, but that doesn't mean you can just do whatever you want. You're interfering with an ongoing investigation." Jacob narrowed his eyes. "What investigation?" Nolan crossed his arms. "We received an anonymous report about a dangerous animal on hospital grounds. When we arrived, we found an unregistered pit bull, which, according to city law, needs to be impounded." David scoffed. Except, as we just established, city law doesn't apply here. Nolan ignored him. You're harboring an animal that could be a threat to public safety. The hospital is full of patients. What if this thing attacks someone? Jacob's fists clenched. Shadow isn't a thing. He's a decorated service dog. He has more discipline than half the men in your department. A flicker of anger crossed Nolan's face, but he recovered quickly. Maybe. But I still have the authority to investigate a public safety concern. He pulled out his radio. And if you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to escalate this to the next level. Jacob could hear the tension in the air, the unspoken challenge hanging between them. Nolan wasn't just trying to take Shadow, he was trying to prove a point. He wanted to show everyone that he had power, that his word was final. Emma stepped forward, placing herself between Jacob and Nolan. You don't have any legal grounds for this. Shadow has never shown aggression. He's registered under Jacob's name as a military service animal. If you try to take him, you'll be violating federal protections. Nolan's jaw twitched, but he didn't back down. Then prove it. Jacob X. Harpley. He didn't have time for this. He needed to end this now. I don't have to prove anything to you, Nolan. But if you really want to play this game, let's take it up the chain. You want to get the federal authorities involved? Be my guest. For the first time, Nolan hesitated. This wasn't the response he had expected. Jacob wasn't panicking, wasn't scrambling for excuses. He was challenging Nolan to push harder, because he knew that if this went any higher, Nolan would be the one in trouble. But Nolan wasn't done yet. He took a step back, raising his radio to his mouth. Let's see what the department has to say about this. Jacob's stomach tightened. The fight was far from over. Static crackled from Nolan's radio as he spoke into it, his voice laced with irritation. This is Officer Nolan requesting immediate backup at the VIA hospital. Possible obstruction of justice and interference with an ongoing investigation. Jacob's pulse pounded, but his face remained unreadable. He had been in situations like this before, outnumbered, outgunned, and yet still standing his ground. He wasn't about to let Nolan intimidate him. David crossed his arms, shaking his head. Calling for backup? You really think that's necessary? Nolan ignored him, eyes locked on Jacob. I suggest you step aside before this gets worse for you. Jacob smirked. Worse for me? Or for you? The words hit their mark. Nolan's grip on his radio tightened, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. I'd stand down if I were you. A new figure emerged from the hospital doors. Lieutenant Mark Reynolds, a senior officer from the local police department, strode onto the scene, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. The moment he appeared, several of Nolan's men stiffened. This wasn't someone they wanted to cross. Reynolds stopped a few feet away, his gaze sweeping the tense standoff before settling on Nolan. Mind telling me what the hell is going on here? Nolan straightened. Sir, this man is refusing to hand over an unregistered pit bull, which violates city ordinance. Save it, Reynolds interrupted, his tone sharp. I heard everything over the radio. His gaze shifted to Jacob. This your dog? Jacob nodded. Yes, sir. Military service animal. Retired. Registered under federal law. Reynolds exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. Then he turned back to Nolan. Did you even bother checking that before you started threatening to arrest people? Nolan stiffened. The city has regulations. And this isn't city jurisdiction, Reynolds shot back. This is federal property, and unless the VIA hospital requests intervention, you have no authority here. A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Nolan's face turned red, but he was trapped. He had overplayed his hand, and now there was no way out without making himself look even worse. Jacob kept his expression neutral, but inside, relief spread through him. Shadow was safe. For now. Reynolds took a step closer to Nolan, lowering his voice so only he could hear. Do yourself a favor, Nolan. Walk away before you make this worse. For a long moment, it seemed like Nolan might argue. His fists clenched at his sides, his pride warring with reality. But finally, with a stiff nod, he muttered, "Let's go." As he turned and stalked away, his men hesitated, then followed. Jacob exhaled, feeling Shadow press against his leg. He reached down, running a hand over the dog's fur. "Looks like we're not done fighting yet, buddy," he murmured. But this battle? This one, they had won. The moment Nolan spoke into his radio, Jacob knew things were about to get worse. The man wasn't going to back down, not when his authority had been publicly challenged. And Jacob had seen men like him before, men who let their egos dictate their actions. A crackle came through Nolan's radio, followed by a voice. "Officer Nolan, status update?" Nolan smirked, glancing at Jacob before responding. "We have a situation at the VA hospital. Individual refusing to comply with an animal confiscation order. Possible obstruction of justice. Requesting backup." Jacob's muscles tensed. Backup. That meant more officers, more tension, more chances for things to spiral out of control. Around him, his fellow veterans exchanged wary glances. They had been through enough battles to recognize when things were about to escalate. Emma stepped forward again, her voice tight with anger. "You're seriously calling for backup over a dog? Do you hear how ridiculous that sounds?" Nolan ignored her, keeping his eyes locked on Jacob. "You could end this right now, you know," he said smoothly. "Just hand over the dog, and we all walk away." Jacob exhaled slowly. Not happening. Minutes later, the sound of approaching sirens filled the air. The tension thickened. A police SUV pulled up, and 3 more officers stepped out, surveying the scene. One of them, a senior officer named Captain Reed, frowned as he took in the situation. "Nolan," Reed said, his voice carrying authority. "What's going on here?" Nolan straightened. "Sir, this man is interfering with an animal control order. The dog is unregistered and falls under the city's dangerous breed ordinance." Reed turned to Jacob. "That true?" Jacob met his gaze without hesitation. "Shadow is my service dog. He's registered under military protocol. And since we're standing on federal property, city laws don't apply." Reed glanced at the VA hospital entrance, then back at Nolan. "Is that right?" Nolan's jaw clenched. "It's a gray area, sir." Reed gave him a long, unreadable look before sighing. "You dragged me out here over a gray area?" Nolan bristled. "Sir, I'm following protocol." "No, you're pushing a fight you can't win." Reed shook his head. "Last I checked, we don't make arrests over technicalities." Jacob felt a flicker of hope, but it was too soon to relax. Nolan wasn't finished yet. "Sir, with all due respect, if we back down now, we set a precedent. If we let people challenge authority like this, what stops someone else from ignoring regulations next time?" Reed studied him for a moment, then turned to Jacob. "Look, I don't want this to turn into something bigger. But I need to know for sure. Do you have the paperwork proving this dog is registered under Federal Service Animal Protections?" Jacob's heartbeat quickened. He had the papers, but they were in his truck. And Nolan knew it. The bastard smirked. "Then I guess we have a problem." Jacob's mind raced. He knew exactly what Nolan was trying to do: stall, apply pressure, force him into making a mistake. If he left to get the documents, he'd turn his back on the situation, giving Nolan the opportunity to twist things in his favor. If he refused, he'd look like he was hiding something. Either way, Nolan was trying to manipulate the moment to justify taking Shadow. Jacob clenched his jaw, keeping his expression unreadable. "The paperwork is in my truck," he said evenly. "Give me 2 minutes and I'll bring it here." Nolan smirked like he had already won. "Not so fast." If you walk away now, I could call that resisting an investigation." Jacob took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "You just asked for proof. I'm getting you proof. Unless you're telling me you don't actually care about the truth." Captain Reed exhaled sharply, clearly growing impatient. "Nolan, enough. If he has the paperwork, let him get it." Nolan hesitated, his grip on his belt tightening, but he couldn't argue without looking like an idiot in front of his superior. "Fine. But I'm coming with him." Jacob barely resisted the urge to roll his eyes. "Whatever makes you sleep at night." Without another word, he turned and headed toward his truck, Shadow walking obediently beside him while Nolan trailed close behind. Jacob could feel the officer's presence looming just a little too close, as if waiting for him to slip up. He reached the truck, unlocked it, and pulled open the glove compartment. The folder with Shadow's adoption papers, service records, and registration was right where he had left it. He grabbed it, then turned back to Nolan, holding the documents up. "Here. Every piece of paper you need." Nolan barely glanced at them before scoffing. "You really think a few sheets of paper are enough to change my mind?" Jacob's patience snapped. "This isn't about the law for you, is it? You just want to win. You want to prove that your badge gives you the right to do whatever the hell you want." Nolan's smirk faded for a split second, his mask slipping just enough for Jacob to see the truth beneath it. Then, just as quickly, the arrogance returned. "I don't make the laws. I enforce them." "No," Jacob said coldly. "You twist them to fit your own damn agenda." Before Nolan could respond, a voice called from behind them. "That's enough." Captain Reed had walked over, clearly fed up. He held out a hand. "Let me see the papers." Jacob handed them over, watching as Reed flipped through them. A long silence stretched between them before the captain finally sighed. "This is all in order." He turned to Nolan. "We're done here." Nolan's expression darkened. "Sir," I said, "we're done." Reed's voice was final. "We've wasted enough time on this." Jacob saw the muscle in Nolan's jaw tighten, his fingers flexing at his side as if itching to push things further. But even he knew when he was outmatched. With a sharp inhale, he stepped back. "Fine." Then, without another word, he turned and stalked away, his shoulders stiff with barely contained rage. Jacob let out a slow breath, his pulse finally beginning to settle. The fight wasn't over, but for now he had won. Jacob watched as Nolan stalked away, his shoulders tense with frustration, but he knew the man wasn't finished. People like Nolan never accepted defeat so easily. There was always another angle, another move. And Jacob was right. Just as he was about to turn back toward his fellow veterans, Nolan suddenly stopped, spun on his heel, and pulled out his radio again. "Dispatch, this is Officer Nolan. I need a unit to set up a checkpoint at the hospital exit. Subject is in possession of an unregistered animal and may attempt to leave the premises." Jacob's blood ran cold. Nolan was trying to trap him, to create a scenario where Shadow could still be taken. He wasn't backing down, he was escalating. Captain Reed's eyes narrowed. "Nolan, stand down." "Sir," Nolan said smoothly, "I'm simply ensuring that this matter is handled properly. If he tries to leave with the dog, we'll have probable cause to detain him." "You don't have jurisdiction here," Reed snapped. "And you're dangerously close to stepping over the line." But Nolan wasn't listening. He was doubling down, his pride too wounded to let this go. He turned back to Jacob, his smirk returning. "Let's see how far you get, soldier." Jacob's pulse pounded in his ears. He could see the trap closing around him. If he tried to leave now, Nolan would twist the situation into a confrontation. And Jacob knew exactly how that would end, with Shadow in the back of an animal control van, and himself in handcuffs. Emma stepped up beside him, her voice a furious whisper. "He's trying to push you into a mistake." "I know," Jacob muttered. David Cole, his fellow Marine, crossed his arms. "So what's the move?" Jacob glanced down at Shadow, who stood calmly by his side, unaware of the storm brewing around him. They had come too far to lose now. He had to think. Fast. Then, suddenly, an idea hit him. A risky one, but if it worked, it would end this once and for all. He turned to Captain Reed. "Sir, would you mind sticking around for a few more minutes?" Reed studied him, then gave a slow nod. "I'm listening." Jacob took a deep breath. "If Nolan wants to play legal games, let's play. But we're going to do it by the book." A plan was forming. A way to turn Nolan's arrogance against him. And this time, Jacob wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. Jacob squared his shoulders and met Nolan's gaze head on. "You want to make this official? Fine. Let's document everything." He gestured to Captain Reed. "Since you're the highest-ranking officer here, I want a formal record of this incident. Let's call the VS Legal Department and make sure we're following federal procedures to the letter. If Shadow is to be confiscated, I want it in writing signed by the proper authorities, not just some local officer trying to flex his power." Nolan's smirk faltered. Jacob could see the gears turning in his head, calculating whether he could still twist this situation in his favor. But Jacob wasn't done. "Oh, and while we're at it," he continued, voice dangerously calm, "I'd like to file an official complaint regarding abuse of authority. Since you're so keen on following protocol, let's make sure Internal Affairs gets a full report." Nolan's expression darkened. He had walked straight into a trap of his own making. If he kept pushing, he'd be under scrutiny, not just from Jacob and his people, but from his own department. Captain Reed, sensing Nolan's growing discomfort, exhaled sharply. "Nolan, I think we've wasted enough time here. The paperwork checks out, the dog isn't a threat, and this isn't our jurisdiction. Stand down." Nolan's jaw clenched, but for the first time, he had no comeback. He had overplayed his hand, and now everyone was watching to see what he would do next. For a long moment, he just stood there, his pride warring with reality. Then, without another word, he reached for his radio and muttered, "Cancel the checkpoint." The tension in the air broke. Around them, the veterans exchanged knowing looks. Emma let out a slow breath, and Shadow, sensing the shift, wagged his tail slightly. Jacob, however, kept his gaze locked on Nolan, waiting. This wasn't just about winning the argument. It was about making sure Nolan never pulled something like this again. Nolan took one last look at Jacob, his eyes burning with quiet rage, before turning on his heel and walking away. His retreat felt like a victory, but Jacob knew this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. Men like Nolan never forgot when they lost. But for now, the fight was over. Jacob knelt beside Shadow, running a hand over the dog's head. "We did it, buddy." Shadow licked his hand in response, as if he had never doubted the outcome. Emma crouched beside them, shaking her head. "You really know how to pick your battles, don't you?" Jacob smirked. "Only the ones worth fighting." As the remaining officers dispersed and the crowd thinned, Jacob stood tall, watching Nolan disappear down the street. Today, justice had won. But something told him that this war wasn't over yet. The last police vehicle pulled away, its flashing lights fading into the distance. The tension that had gripped the air for so long finally began to dissolve, replaced by a quiet, victorious stillness. Jacob exhaled, the adrenaline in his veins slowly ebbing away. He had won this round, but he knew better than to think it was truly over. Nolan was the type to hold a grudge, and men like him always found ways to strike back when least expected. Shadow leaned against Jacob's leg, his familiar presence grounding him. Jacob knelt, running his fingers through the dog's fur. "Looks like you're staying with me, buddy," he murmured. Shadow let out a small huff, as if he had never doubted the outcome. Emma watched them, her arms crossed, her expression a mix of relief and exasperation. You know, you could have just let me handle that, she said. Jacob smirked. And miss out on all the fun? Not a chance. She rolled her eyes, but there was warmth in her gaze. Well, next time you decide to pick a fight with law enforcement, at least give me a heads up. David Cole stepped forward, clapping Jacob on the shoulder. Damn good work, Marine. You handled that exactly the way it needed to be handled. He glanced down at Shadow. And you, my friend, are one lucky dog. Jacob gave a small chuckle. He's not the only one. Emma sighed, shifting her weight. So what now? Nolan might have backed down today, but you know he's not just going to let this go. Jacob stood, his eyes narrowing as he gazed at the empty street where Nolan had disappeared. No, he won't, he admitted. But now he knows that we don't back down either. Emma shook her head. You always did have a bad habit of making enemies. Jacob turned to her, his smirk returning. Yeah, but I make good friends too. He glanced at David and the others who had stood beside him today. They weren't just old comrades. They were family. And if Nolan ever tried something again, he wouldn't just be facing Jacob, he'd be facing all of them. For now though, the fight was over. The night was quiet again, the only sound the distant hum of city traffic. The VIA hospital stood behind them, a place meant for healing, and tonight, it had also been a battleground for justice. Jacob looked down at Shadow one last time before glancing at Emma. You hungry? She raised an eyebrow. Are you asking me out? Jacob shrugged. I figure after all that, we've earned a decent meal. Emma studied him for a moment before smiling. All right, Marine. But you're buying. Jacob grinned as they turned and walked toward his truck, Shadow trotting beside them. Tonight they had won a battle. Tomorrow? That was a fight for another day. And whatever came next, Jacob was ready.